I'm Deborah Richmond, and behind me is a quilt that is a snowball quilt that is a scrap quilt. I'm going to show you how to make this quilt. It's very, very simple. I love this quilt because it's made of only 2 different blocks. Now let me show you the blocks. So these are the 2 blocks that we're going to be making this whole quilt out of. First, you can see this block is a set of 4 patches inside of a 9 patch. And you can see that block shows right here, and so on. You'll also see in this block there is a dark stripe of fabric. I'm going to show you as we make this block where to put those dark squares in order to keep this nice running dark stripe that goes through the quilt. When you're close up to the quilt, it's rather subtle. You don't necessarily see it. Farther away from the quilt you are, you can see that nice stripe very, very prominently in the quilt. The second block we're going to be putting together is the snowball block, and this one I'll show you is right here and right here. So you can see that every other block is a snowball block and every other block is the 9 patch block. So let's show you how to put those together. Here are the 2 blocks we're going to be working on. We're going to start with the 9 patch. So we're going to take the snowball away. This is a 9 patch. You can see there are the 9 blocks. And inside our 9 patch we also have 4 patches that we have 4 blocks. So this makes a pretty busy square. Now don't worry about that. As you're putting these together, they're going to seem kind of too busy, but as you put them into the quilt, the pattern will appear and it will look really nice. The key to a good scrap quilt is the more scraps you use, the better they all look together. So let's start showing you how to put it together. So you're going to start by cutting strips. You're going to want 1.5 inch strips, and you want a wide variety of different fabrics. When you sew them together, you're going to sew them together and go with a high contrast and a lower contrast. Now this one's pretty subtle. There's not a lot of contrast between the 2. That's okay though. There'll be enough that are higher contrast that will carry the pattern, and it keeps it interesting to have some that are a little bit less contrast and some that are a little more. So don't worry too much when you're putting fabrics together. Just do your best to kind of do light and dark, and let's sew those together. Now we have sewn the strips together just as you see. Now the reason we have these sewn together is we now need to cut them into smaller pieces to make the squares that will turn into the 4 patch. So you're going to take a ruler and a rotary color, and you're going to cut an 1.5 inch block, 1.5 inch unit, 1.5 inch unit, until you have cut up this entire strip. Same thing with the second strip. Now we're going to take 2 of these blocks and we're going to then sew them together so we have our 4 patch corner, and you can see that it will look just like this. We now will need to make 5 of those, and you're going to go ahead and sew a bunch of units so that you get lots of different variety in the fabrics that you're using. You're going to need 5 of these to put together into our 9 patch. The other thing you're going to need is you're going to need some squares of fabric that are 2.5 inch squares. When you're choosing fabrics for the 2.5 inch squares, choose the lighter fabrics. And so here are the 4 we're going to use. And I'm going to show you how we're going to put this together. So here you see, here are the units we're going to sew together. Now I've made sure that when I place them, we have a 4 patch, a solid square, and a 4 patch. The opposite is true for row number 2. We have a solid square, a 4 patch, and a solid square. And then row number 3 is exactly the same as row number 1 with a 4 patch, a solid square, and a 4 patch. When you get this set up and you're ready to sew it, make sure that your high contrasts are in the corner. And with mine, I have started from left to right. So I make sure that all my high contrasts will be in a diagonal from top left down to bottom right. So these are the higher contrasts. Some are very, again, obvious. Some of them not necessarily so. If it's not perfect, it's okay. Some of that variety in this quilt will make your eye travel around it, and you'll see that the pattern will still appear. So we're going to sew these into our rows. These 3 together first, these 3 together second, and then the 3rd row. Sewing those 3 rows together will create the block. And here is the block. And again, this one's easier to see. I made sure that those higher contrasts are here in this diagonal. Same thing in this diagonal, and the same thing in this diagonal here. So that's the 9 patch block. Now moving on to the snowball block. This is a very simple block. You start with 1 square 6.5 inches of your background fabric. which looks like this. And then we're going to be cutting 4 2.5-inch squares. And on each one of those, we're going to take those, and with a ruler and a pencil, we are going to sew a diagonal line. Draw a diagonal line from the top corner to the bottom corner, diagonally across the block. You're going to do the same with all 4 squares. Now you're going to place them on top of your 6.5-inch block, and I'm going to take it to the sewing machine. I'm going to sew along this line. I'm going to do that each time with every block. Same thing, draw the line, place it on, sew it. Then when I have 4 corners that are sewn down, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and I'm going to fold it on that sewing line, that seam line, and then I'm going to press it. So you can see we've now created, this will create the corners of the snowball block. So here's the snowball block. We have put those corners on. The last step in this that you're going to do is when you have your corners sewn on, you're going to bring it back to your cutting table. You're going to pull back, open this back up. You'll see that you'll still have this square fabric. You're going to take a ruler and your rotary cutter, and you're going to then trim this to a 1/4 inch seam. So you get a nice pretty 1/4 inch seam. Fold them back and you have your block. Now these are 6.5-inch blocks that we're making, and a lot of quilts will call for 6.5-inch blocks. It's a common block size. OmniGrid has, this is one of my favorite rulers. It's a square ruler by OmniGrid, and it is 6.5 inches. And this is perfect for squaring up any of the 6.5-inch blocks. So once I have my block created, I want to square it up, make sure it's nice and neat and just the right size. You will have a little bit of distortion and hang over on some of these corners. All you're going to do is you're going to lay your square down. It's exactly the size we want of 6.5 inches. And you can see right here we have a little extra hanging over. I'm going to take my rotary cutter and I'm just going to trim that right off. I'll do the same thing on all 4 sides, and then I have a nice pretty 6.5-inch block to put into my quilt. Now the quilt behind me is for a single-size bed, and to make it you're going to need 50 9-patch blocks and 50 snowball blocks. Now that sounds like a lot, but they go very quickly, and again, you're really going to use up a lot of your scraps in your basket. So just start making them, and before you know it, you've got enough to put together this quilt. To put the quilt together, you're going to sew it in rows. First you're going to assemble blocks across, and then you're going to sew them down. So for your first row, you're going to start in the corner with a 9-patch block, and then sew the next one will be a snowball, the next is a 9-patch, and then a snowball, and you keep alternating all the way across this row. And this row has 9 blocks in it. The next row you are going to start with a snowball. This time it's a snowball first, then the 9-patch, then the snowball, then the 9-patch, and you keep alternating. You're going to create 11 rows, and you're going to sew starting at the top. Row number 1 will be sewn to row number 2 until you have finished your quilt. Now you can make this quilt larger or smaller, and it simply just depends on how many blocks you decide to make and sew together. This particular quilt is then finished with just a very simple 2.5-inch border, so it keeps it nice and simple. This is a great quilt for beginners, and it's a great quilt to really get rid of those scraps you have piling up and make a really stunning quilt. Again, this is the Scrappy Snowball. Thanks for joining me.
And be sure to subscribe to our channel. You can do so here by clicking the subscribe button. That way you'll find out about new videos as they become available.